Here at Mass Union, and this is our webinar on MOUs, Memorandums of Understanding with your housing authority. Okay, so I'm going to thank Judy Okulski because for like 1,000 years, Judy has been asking Mass Union to provide more resources on MOUs. Today is your day, Judy. We're finally doing it. So thank you for your tireless advocacy inside and outside of our community. And welcome to everyone who is here. It's great to have such a huge group. We are doing a follow-up webinar in July that will focus on negotiation skills. So today we have 2 attorneys plus a tenant here to share their story. A part of this is legal, but a big part of it is also organizing and negotiating. So that's why this is a 2-part series. So just keep in mind that we will go way into more depth about negotiation on July 9th. So hold some of your questions for that. And today we'll talk more about sort of the legal side of things. And to do that, we have 2 amazing lawyers. We have Annette Duke from Mass Law Reform, who everyone knows, I think. And we have Susan Hegel, who many of you know, who's with the Cambridge and Somerville Legal Services. She's been working with tenants there for a very long time, done a lot of really great work with tenants in Cambridge and Somerville. And speaking of which, we have the president of the Mystic Tenants Association, Ray Santana from Somerville, and she's going to talk about her experience negotiating an MOU with the Somerville Housing Authority. Those are our presenters. We have those 3 wonderful folks. As I said, please keep your questions to the end, and we will address them all at the end. Feel free to add them to the chat as we go along. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is actually ask a little bit more about who you guys are. So the first question we're going to ask, and this should hopefully be up on your screen now, is what kind of housing you live in. So please let us know if you live in state public housing, federal public housing, Section 8, or you're not sure. Or if you don't live in any of those, you can just skip this and leave it blank. All right, so the questions are rolling, or the answers are rolling in. Thank you. Give this another minute or another second or 2. Okay. All right. So I'm gonna show the results, I think. So most of us are in state housing, 18 out of the 26 who responded. And then we have 7 folks from federal and 1 person who doesn't know. So thank you everyone for sharing that information. Most of us, again, are in state housing. Okay, so let me get that away. Let's see if I can launch the next poll. Is everyone, oh no, here I have launch. Okay, so now we have 2 questions specifically about your Memorandum of Understanding. That's what MOU stands for again. The first one, has your tenant organization ever tried to negotiate an MOU with the housing authority? And we know that sometimes you try and you fail. Not because you're not trying, but because the housing authority won't sit down with you, or there's any number of reasons. So we just want to get a sense of how many people have tried to start this process. And we're going to talk about what to do if the housing authority won't sit down with you. We know that's a huge question. And then the second question is, do you currently have an MOU with the housing authority? So keep the answers rolling in. We've got about 25, 26 responses to the first one, catching up on the second one. Thank you very much. Keep going, and we'll give you another couple seconds. All right, I think we're gonna, they're both on the, they should both be on the same screen. So just scroll down if you only see one. Okay, so let's show the results. Okay, so for the first one, you're broken into thirds, more or less. 11 people have tried to negotiate an MOU, 9 have not, and 10 are not sure. And that makes a lot of sense because you don't always know what has happened before you came along. And then, does your LTO currently have an MOU with the housing authority? 5 of you only said yes, so not very many. 8 of you said no, and 8 of you said not sure. Okay. Is that helpful, Annette and Susan? Yes, good. All right, great. Okay, so with that, is it still on the screen or did it go away?
I clicked mine off, so it's off.
Okay, so no one is seeing it anymore. Okay, good. I don't want to be in the way. All right, so with that, let's pass it to Annette.
Good morning, everyone. It's so good to see you, Annette Duke from Mass Law Reform. And I'm really excited to be here with my partner, Susan Hegel, and Ray from Somerville to talk about MOUs. So I hope everyone was able to get a link to the booklet that we just updated, hot off the press. Um, it was developed by Mass Law Reform and Legal Services years ago with input from Mass Union along the way. It's got a long history, and we just updated it last month, actually in June, so it's got a June date. So it's fresh, and a lot of people, had input into this, so I'm grateful for that. It's broken up into 4 sections. We hope that this is easy to use. The first section is creating a memo of understanding. Susan's going to go through some of this. The second section is negotiating a memo of understanding. Susan's going to go through some of this, but this is also going to be in the second webinar. Um, the third section is called special circumstances, and that involves where an LTO may represent both state and federal, or an MOU covers a citywide or town local tenant group, or you may be facing redevelopment. MOUs get developed in the process of that. The final section, which could be the toughest of all the sections, is enforcing the MOU, and that we expect is going to come up a lot. Um, the booklet includes a glossary. So if you come across a term you're not familiar with, turn to the glossary. We try to italicize those terms. Housing is notorious for having a lot of terms that, need definition. Um, but the gem part of this booklet is that it includes 2 practical action-oriented tools. It includes a letter that you can send your housing authority requesting a meeting to start to negotiate a memorandum of understanding. And more importantly, it includes a template. So you don't have to start with a blank piece of paper. And Sarah and Mass Union can send you a Word document that you can start to review with your tenants, and then attach that to your letter. So don't just send a letter, but send a letter with your first draft because you want to be in the driver's seat. You want to set the tone. You don't want to ask the housing authority to send you a draft memo. You want to draft the first version of it. And you're going to expect that there's going to be a lot of back and forth. We'll talk about that. But the booklet has a template that is been tested, it's up to date. It's got what's required, it's got what's not required, but what you can add. So there's a lot there. And again, Sarah can send you that Word document. At the end, you will find the end notes. This is the legal backup for some of the principles. And I know you are all secretly lawyers, and you like to have the law, and that's what puts you in a position of power if you can cite the law to your housing authority as you go through this. So those end notes are there to be used. Um, and so that's the booklet. And I would enjoy if you have any feedback, please let us know. It is a living document. When we update it, it's good to include more experiences. So with that, Sarah, should I pass it over to Susan?
Yep. Good morning, everyone. Again, my name is Susan Hegel, and I'm a housing attorney at Cambridge and Somerville Legal Services, which is part of Greater Boston Legal Services. And I was going to just to make sure we're all on the same page, an MOU or Memo of Understanding, is essentially a written agreement between a tenant organization and a housing authority. It's a binding contract, and it spells out the working relationship between the tenant association and the housing authority, including the support that the housing authority is going to provide and the ways for the tenant organization to have input into the housing authority's policies and modernization plans or forms or leases or, a whole bunch of documents that sort of govern life in public housing. Um, So that's what an MOU is. And I wanted to just quickly refer to the booklet about why it's important. So for those that have the booklet, it's on page 6. There's basically 6 different reasons about why having an MOU is important. So it builds a working relationship with the housing authority. It sets up a structure for the partnership between the tenant organization and the housing authority. It clarifies how the regulations are going to be interpreted. It sets a better tone for tenant participation because everything is in writing and hopefully clear. It protects the tenant organization over time. So as executive directors or staff or tenant leaders change, you still have this living MOU document. And it's also important, as you'll hear, that there are a lot more rights in state housing. And so then as opposed to federal. And so you can use the MOU to try to give equal rights to state and federal. So that's sort of a very quick overview of what an MOU is and why it's important. First, I wanted to say that for state public housing, the housing authority is required to negotiate an MOU with your tenant organization, sort of regardless of the size of the tenant association or the number of units. And the citation is in your book at the end, as Annette pointed out, but basically it requires that they negotiate an agreement regarding the tenant participation, including resources that the housing authority will provide to the tenant group and opportunities for the tenant group to represent the interests of residents in housing authority initiatives. So that's pretty broad as to what, but it is definitely required. For federal public housing, it's only required if your housing authority has 250 or more federal public housing units. So your development could have less than 250, but if overall in the city or town there are at least 250, then they have to put in writing in the form of an MOU the elements of the partnership. So you can see on the federal side, it's much more bare bones. For federal public housing, sort of regardless of the size or the number of federal public housing units, they are still supposed to negotiate an agreement as to the tenant participation funds. And the regulations require the housing authority funding is only made under a written agreement, and it includes a budget and an accounting of the use and the housing authority right to inspect and audit. So again, for state, it's required. For federal, only if it's 250 or more federal units. So what I wanted to do next is to go through about what exactly is required to be in the MOU. And then sort of go through different suggestions to sort of expand it. So for state public housing, again, unlike federal, there are very detailed regulations spelling out like the minimum of what needs to be in an MOU. And these are in the regulations and they're in various notices that are put out by EOHLC or formerly DHCD. And so what I wanted to do, I listed about 14 different requirements, but I would suggest that the MOU sort of expand upon those and sort of add the operational details. So the first requirement for state public housing is that they have to hold quarterly meetings with somebody at the housing authority with authority. So that's a requirement to be in the MOU, but some examples about how you can sort of expand it to include more details is that you can provide for monthly meetings. You could provide it with or without other tenant groups in the city or town. You could add the date and time. You could say it's going to be the third Monday at 2 o'clock or something like that. So you could sort of spell out the operational details. You can spell out who takes the minutes. You can have certain standing topics of conversation, like in Mystic, parking is always an issue. So parking is sort of a standing topic. And you can also cover the format. Should it be in person? Could there be a hybrid, a Zoom option? So these are all details that would get worked out as part of the negotiations. The second requirement is that the tenant organization has the right to inspect all written policies, procedures, rules, leases, forms, and regulations that are used by the housing authority, and to obtain free copies in most circumstances. So that's what's required. And the MOU, in the sample that we provided, we listed some other important documents that you may want. So you could tailor your MOU to other documents that you want the housing authority to provide. The third requirement is the disbursement of the tenant participation funds. So in your MOU, you may want to sort of clarify the amount to make sure you're all on the same page. It's for units that are available for occupancy by tenants. So if something is being used as a daycare or some other purpose, it doesn't count for the tenant participation funds. You want to maybe add a little bit about the mechanics, like when you submit a budget, the deadlines, any assistance the housing authority will provide in record keeping. And you may want to have a provision that you can seek outside funds that are sort of not governed by the housing authority's control. And you could consider asking the housing authority for more than the tenant participation funds, by way of that they could pay for elections or pay for training. So again, these are details that would be worked out and negotiated and put into the MOU. The fourth thing that's required for state public housing is that the housing authority has to provide office space if it's available without a significant cost or inconvenience to the housing authority. So again, if you are getting an office space, it would be good to put it in the MOU exactly what the location is, to include details about who has keys to it, how many keys, the housing authority access. So you may want to say they have no access absent an emergency, sort of the cleaning and the maintenance of the office space, and sort of the provision of any furniture like desk, table, chairs, locked file cabinets, bookcases, and maybe equipment. Will they provide a computer, a printer, scanner, fax, internet? So things like that may not be required, but you could be subject to the negotiation and put in there. Even if you have a copier, we find that tenant organizations often have big copy jobs. So you want to also probably add in that you would have access to the housing authority's copier and printer for big jobs. The fifth thing is that for state public housing, the housing authority is required to reimburse for basic telephone service. So again, you want to make sure that that is included, and any of the mechanics. Do they just pay the bill? Do you pay the bill and seek reimbursement? So things like that. 6 is whenever possible, the housing authority is to provide community space for tenant organization meetings. So you want to have your MOU add the location of the space that you're allowed to use and how to reserve it, and maybe give you priority over other uses of the space. Maybe allow the housing authority to allow you to post the meetings, or to do robocalls or text messages or things like that to announce the meetings. So those would be details that could be worked out in the MOU. 7, and this is a pretty broad one, is that the housing authority has to seek advice from the tenant organization whenever they propose to adopt or amend a policy that affects the rights, status, duties, or welfare of tenants, or if they plan to seek a waiver of any regulations from the state. And this can be done at the quarterly meeting, but it could also be done in between meetings. And so you may want to add a sort of a timeline and a process so that you get at least 30 days notice of any policy change. And that if you ask for the backup documents, that they have to give it to you, that they have to meet and discuss it with you, and have some, interactive dialogue about why they're changing something, and a written response from the housing authority. So again, these are not requirements, but these are details that could be worked out in the MOU. One thing that is not mentioned in here, but we will, I think, add it in the next draft, is that there's a public housing notice, actually that was, I think, secured by Mass Union, that provides that tenants have input into the management agreement with another housing authority, or if two housing authorities are going to merge. And it's sort of under that because that would affect the status and rights of tenants. So they're required to give you notice of that and have a discussion. 8, the housing authority has to provide an opportunity for you to appear and make known to the Board of Commissioners any objection to any of the policies. And the Board of Commissioners is the 5-person, except in Boston, is the 5-person governing body of the housing authority. And so you may want to add to the MOU, and we have suggested language in the sample, that you can have input at the beginning in general, but also input at each agenda item that affects tenants at a meaningful time before they take a vote. Because you don't want them to take a vote and then listen to your input after the fact. 9 is that they have to consult at the quarterly meetings with the tenant group on the annual plan. 10 is that they have to consult on modernization programs, and the regulations spell out quite a level of detail about your input and involvement. But you may want to have more sort of general provisions about that you want to have input into every step of the process of modernization, especially if it includes relocation. 11 is that the housing authority has to notify the tenant organization about job openings that are available for outside candidates, and to provide input where the job opening has direct dealings with residents. So that is a pretty broad term, and it includes obviously the executive director, and there's a separate notice from the state about involvement of the tenant organization in interviewing executive directors. So you may want to, again, have more details sort of spelled out in the MOU about the level of input, if that's something, that the tenant group wants. 12 is that for the Board of Commissioners meetings, they have to provide you notice of the meeting and the agenda and allow for comment. And also, once the minutes are approved, give you copies. What we found is that the agenda is often bare bones, but that there's a packet of information that is shared with the Board of Commissioners. So you want to maybe add a provision that the Housing Authority share not just the notice of the meeting and the agenda, but all the backup documents. And that they send that to you by email at the same time that they provide it to the board. And again, you want to make sure that you have time for input before the board takes a vote. 13, the Housing Authority must encourage and assist the tenant association so that again is sort of broad language, and you can use that to say that they would allow posting of notices of your meetings, posting of your election steps, giving tenants keys to the buildings so that they could flyer it if you're sort of scattered site, require the housing authority to do robocalls or text messages in different languages about meetings or important deadlines for the tenant association. To post all the tenant association contact information in the management office on the website. And you may want to have, draft something that should be included in an orientation packet for new residents about the tenant organization. So that language about encouraging and assisting could be very broad and encompass a lot. The last thing that's required is that there does have to be sort of a duration. And for state public housing, it's 5 years. So you want to make sure that you do have a date on your MOU and that you have, recommended that there'll be some renewal term so that it will automatically be renewed for another 5 years unless either party notifies the other, like with 60 days, 30 days, that they want to renegotiate or that they want to renegotiate on certain topics. So again, you can add those details to the MOU, and it should be signed by the executive director and at least the board president, if not all the board members. So you need to have it needs to be dated and signed to be sort of an enforceable contract. So that very quickly are the different requirements in the state regulations, and they're all, again, they're described in the booklet and the regulations are cited, and I would just urge you to read them as to exactly what is required. Unfortunately for those in federal public housing, there's not a lot of specifics about what needs to be in the MOU. It has some like general language that they will support the tenant association activities, that they'll provide guidance when requested. So basically the requirements, if you have 250 or more, is that if the tenant association requests, they have to negotiate use of the community space. If the tenant association asks, they should provide office space and meeting facilities without charge, including considering a vacant apartment. They shall ensure open communication and frequent meetings, but again, there's nothing, and working committees, but again, no details in the federal. They do have to provide the tenant participation funds, and it has to be updated at least once every 3 years. So for state, it's 5, for federal, it's 3. And so given that there's not a lot of details or requirements for federal, our suggestion would be that if your housing authority has any state public housing, you should advocate for the same rights for the federal, because the housing authority is familiar with the state public housing requirements. They're doing it for another tenant association. So, it would be hard for them to say, no, you should be treated differently. So I would sort of encourage,
Southbound jammed up on that lower deck.
whoops. Okay, so that's sort of an overview of what's required for state and what's required for federal. And I did want to just sort of highlight for special circumstances, and these are described more detail in the booklet. But if a tenant association is representing both state and federal public housing, either in adjacent developments or in different places, you want to make sure that the MOU covers rights under both. If the housing authority is under a management agreement with another housing authority, you want to make sure that the MOU covers both housing authorities, and that both housing authorities sign it. If the housing authority is planning to redevelop public housing, either to demolish and rebuild, or to do substantial rehab, there's often going to be a change in the ownership and the funding source. So you want to make sure that the MOU is going to cover this new arrangement. So if it is going to be redeveloped, that you will still be recognized, still get the tenant participation funds, and everything would hopefully be the same. And then finally, there are tenant associations that are either city or townwide. So they cover all the developments in a city or a town, or they may include Section 8 voucher tenants. So you want to, again, just make sure that the language includes provisions for those tenants as well. So that very quickly, hopefully, was my summary of sort of the MOU negotiation. And now I think I'm going to turn it over to Ray, who actually went through the process with the Housing Authority, a fairly amiable process. So Ray?
Hi, everybody. I'm Ray. I'm the president of the Mystic Tenant Association. Just a little bit about how to successfully negotiate an MOU. One of the biggest thing is being confident in what you're asking for. I think oftentimes the housing authorities will not take you seriously because you guys are not lawyers and you guys are not, management or anything like that. So make sure that you know what you're negotiating and what you really want. Because sometimes they might say no, but you can find a middle ground and understand that an MOU is a contract, right? And treat it as such. One of the first things to do is call mass union, and then decide which board members will lead the negotiation of the MOU. Most of the time, it would be two people there negotiating. Be sure to include the community in what you're doing and what you're asking for, and what you're really going to fight for, and what matters to the community and what matters to your board. Then check if you have an MOU already. Like for us, we had an MOU that was from like I think the 80s or the 90s. And what we did, we just reworded some things, we redrafted some things, and we negotiated to what we actually needed and wanted. I think in theirs they had like a fax machine, and obviously we don't really use fax machines anymore. So just little things like that to remove and change and adapt to what you need now. Then see um, and then just figure out what you want to change based off that. Then you're gonna draft your MOU and then give the draft to housing. And once housing has it, they'll read through it and see what they're not willing to work with you, and then they'll send you back their changes and their edits. If you get lucky, you won't get any edits, and they'll just agree. Like for us, we had to negotiate office supplies. They weren't trying to give us office supplies, or like we had to ask for a computer. And that was one thing that we had to just be like, okay, like we're fine without getting the computer, but can you guys still provide the office supplies? And they kind of met us in that middle ground. And then once that's adapted and you guys both agree, you guys sign it, then we showed it to our first community meeting, had them, know that we had negotiated what we negotiated, gave the residents like access to seeing that we actually did these things. And that's it. I think I covered everything.
Great. Thanks, Ray. I think Annette is up next, and I'm going to put a summary of what Ray said in the chat because there was a lot of good information there.
I think Susan's on enforcement.
Oh, my
Yeah,
bad.
and
Sorry.
then yeah, and then if anybody like needs any assistance or help or any questions aside from that, I'll throw in my email in there just in case anybody needs additional help.
Thanks, Ray.
All right. So wanted to talk a little bit about enforcement, because I understand that not everybody has an experience like Ray did, where although it took like 3 months, it was a fairly non-hostile process. So if a housing authority simply refuses to negotiate, first you want to make sure that you do have a paper trail. So as Ray mentioned, you know, the tenant association would draft their MOU and send it to the housing authority. So ideally you would have a cover letter or an email. You may want to have a couple email reminders saying, please get back to me about any proposed changes. Please give us some dates for meetings. Or say, here are the dates we're available. Let us know what works for you. So, be patient and set up a paper trail. If you're still not getting anywhere, again, I would reach out to Mass Union, both for organizing support and also for connection to legal services if that becomes necessary. If I would talk to every tenant board of the 5 commissioners, there's going to be a tenant rep. So you could try talking to the tenant rep, or you could try talking to the chair or the governor's appointment. Just sort of informally to see if they could get the housing authority executive director to sort of move on negotiating. And if that doesn't work, go talk at the Board of Commissioners at the Housing Authority at a public meeting during the public comment period or at the beginning and announce, your concern, go through your paper trail. I don't know if it's universal, but like in Cambridge, they do have a local press there that would cover the story. So you may even want to reach out to any local newspaper to have them cover the board meeting. And finally, if you don't get anywhere, you can complain to HLC if it's state public housing. You can complain to HUD, but it probably at this point won't go anywhere on the federal side. But at least it sounds like most of the people here are from state. And then even if you have an MOU, there are times where the housing authority doesn't follow it. So if they're not following it, you do want to sort of point to them to the provision and to the page and say, this is what we had negotiated. So when you're drafting the MOU, you want to try to make sure the language is as clear as possible with the idea, keeping in mind, that you may need to enforce it. So you don't want to have a lot of waffly language, things like to the extent possible, or, just try to make it firm so that if they don't do it, you can point to a clear violation. And then if they still, won't do it, go through the same steps as before, reach out to Mass Union, talk to the tenant rep on the board, go to the full board, or complain to the state agency that oversees the housing authority. So all the same steps. And these are sort of described in sections 11 and 13 in your booklet. So you should read that. And then finally, you can always sue the housing authority. And in at the end, there's a citation to a lawsuit that was filed by Fall River. And the court said, yes, this is a contract and we're going to enforce it. And the tenants won. So just keep that in your back pocket. You have the citation here. And hopefully it will not get to that stage, but
Yeah.
that's my part. And I think we're done for Sarah to sort of add in anything.
Yeah. Well, thanks for mentioning the Fall River lawsuit. We do have Dave Underhill here. I don't know if Dave was highly involved at that time, but this is a legally enforceable contract. So that's what gives it so much power. And we're going to open it up for questions in a minute. We've had some really good ones come in the chat. But just remember that everything we do is a reflection of how much power we have. So if you can't get them to the table, that means you need to build more power. If they won't give you a yes on something, that means you need to build more power. And Zafiro is our specialist in building power, along with our whole organizing team, Judy, Catherine, Lara, I see Paula here. So the whole point to call Mass Union, please do. We will build this in as part of your overall LTO power building work. And that is, I think, what I'm going to say.